Live. And welcome to RealAg Live, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining us here today. I'm your host, Shaun Haney. Really looking forward to today's discussion. We are going to break down, I think, a topic that we're going to continue to hear more and more about in Canadian agriculture, and that is biofuels as it applies to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We've got the federal government rolling out a series of climate plans, and biofuels are definitely a component of that. If you want to participate in today's discussion, really hoping that we're going to learn here together with today's guest, all you have to do is enter your question, your comment in the box, whether you're watching on YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook. We are live right now, and that's the beauty of this program, is you get a chance to participate and ask your questions of our guests alongside me. So let's bring in today's guest. It is Don O'Connor. He is his company is S&T Squared Consultants. Don, how are you?
I'm good. Shaun, how are you?
Pretty good. Hey, Don, now you and I just met about 15 minutes ago. You were introduced to me by Terry Daynard, and I really appreciate Terry making that introduction. Can you give us some of your background just so we can establish you with the audience in terms of what you've been doing in the biofuel area?
So I'm a mechanical engineer by training. I got involved in biofuels back in 1981. I joined Mohawk Oil just before they started up the ethanol facility in Minnedosa, and I started offering ethanol gasoline blends in Manitoba back in 1981. So I was with them until 1998. I was vice president of supply and manufacturing and the president of the manufacturing companies at Mohawk. And so, in that time period, we had Minnedosa, that whole time period. We got involved with the Poundmaker people in Lanigan, Saskatchewan with their ethanol plant. So that was really my introduction to agriculture. And I left Mohawk in 1998 when they were bought by Husky, and have had my own consulting company since that time. And in the very beginning, it was a lot of biofuel related work, policy development for some of the provinces, business plans for people who want to get into the business, and some GHG emission calculations. And sort of over the 20 years, the business has evolved, and now it's almost 100% related to GHGs, not only of biofuels and agriculture, but really of all kinds of transportation fuels.
Yeah. So there's obviously a lot of attention being paid right now to biofuels based on this clean fuel standard the government introduced back. Well, I guess a couple of years ago, but it hit Gazette in December. What's your perception or your analysis, I guess, at this point of the CFS based on the work you've done?
So the clean fuel standard is really very similar to programs in California and British Columbia that have been in place since 2010, and the state of Oregon introduced their program in 2015. And so really they set targets for the emission reductions that the government would like to see by a particular year, and the target gets tougher and tougher to meet as the program goes on. And it's really fuel agnostic. And so any fuel with a lower carbon intensity can participate in the program, generate credits, which are used to offset debits that are generated by the sale of fossil fuels. And what we see in California, British Columbia, and Oregon is that the vast majority of the credits are generated by biofuels, or at least have been up to this point in time. But electric vehicles can also generate credits. Compressed natural gas can generate credits. Hydrogen could generate credits. The fuel just has to be lower carbon intensity.
And how is the carbon intensity of the fuel, how is that defined? Because carbon intensity is thrown around a lot, and I'm not sure everybody quite understands it.
So it's done through what's called life cycle assessment, which is a full life cycle. So it starts with, in the case of biofuels, with growing the crop, and then processing it into the fuel, and finally blending it into gasoline. So for something like ethanol, it includes the emissions associated with manufacturing the fertilizer and pesticides, the farm energy that's used in the production of the crop. If there's fossil energy used for crop drying, that's part of it. And then transportation of the crop to the ethanol plant. And again, at the ethanol plant, the energy that goes into making the conversion happen, along with the chemicals. And then finally, the transportation out to the service station.
So, Don, who's doing all that math to keep track of all that?
So there have been developed various programs that help you do that, and so I have one called GH Genius, and my program is used by governments in Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia to figure out the carbon intensity. There's a different program that's used in the United States called GREET, which is very similar in concept. Just some different geographic focus, and so they have a lot of U.S. data. GH Genius has both U.S. and Canadian data. For the federal program, the government has decided to go a little different route. So they're developing their own, what they call a model, but it's really a database that plugs into other computer programs, some of which you buy, one of which is free, and you will put your information into the model and it'll calculate your carbon intensity. Some of the information is sort of background. So an ethanol plant would put in the data that they have from their plants, but the farming data would be generic data that goes into the model, and that would be found from other sources.
Okay, we got a question here from Viren. Thanks for your question, Viren, watching on Facebook. How resilient are these efforts to reduce carbon emissions to the price of oil? We've seen before where as the price of oil goes down, the incentive to follow these programs decreases as well.
So I think that they're relatively independent of the price of oil, because they are government regulations that mandate that if you sell a certain product, you have to meet those requirements, and if you don't, there's fines and financial penalties, and those can vary. In British Columbia, if you don't meet it, you have the opportunity to pay $200 a ton to the government, and have a black mark in terms of failing to meet an environmental standard. In California, the fines can be huge. I mean, even for paperwork mistakes, you can be fined hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so everybody is paying attention big time. In California in particular, there's a very healthy credit market where people who have generated credits but are not an obligated party can sell those on the market. And there's a very healthy market. There's trades every day. The price is up close to the maximum allowed under the regulations. And I think in all the programs we've seen, there's been some resistance. There's been taken some time for the obligated parties to figure out that this is real, that it's not going away. But many of them are now making investments in the hundreds of millions of dollars to build plants to produce products to help them comply.
So, and thanks for the question, Viren. One of the objections I hear from some farmers when it comes to the CFS and just government intervention in a market is that why does the government need to get involved to build the biofuel industry? If it's sustainable, shouldn't it just build itself on its own? Is that realistic? Does that happen in other countries where the government doesn't get involved to build the industry, get it off the ground?
No. So, I mean, I can't think of another country around the world where biofuels has been able to make inroads without the government doing something to require it. And the reason that governments get involved is because we don't today I mean, really, we haven't been putting a price on emissions, and so these externalities, as the economists call them, are not factored into the price that we pay at the pump. If we had to pay the price of carbon at the pump, then the economists think that our behavior would change, and we would do the right thing. Part of the problem is that the people who would have to make the change to make something happen, demand, biofuels, they're the ones that would pay the price, and not the oil company, who's the one that would have to facilitate that happening. So we have uh, we have these markets that aren't perfect, and that's another reason for governments to get involved.
Is the concern that the fuel price, with the CFS implemented, the concern is that it's sort of a double taxation, double carbon taxes. I think some have written. Jack Mintz had an article or opinion column in the National Post to that regard. Is the rise in fuel prices a big concern, or should it be a big concern?
Well, fuel prices are going up. 10 years ago, California tried to tell everybody that fuel prices were going to go down with this program, and that didn't happen. And so I think that fuel prices are likely to go up, and not necessarily because we're adding biofuels, right? So the way the markets work is the fuel price tends to reflect the marginal cost of compliance. So if 90% of your compliance is made up of biofuels that have a very small cost, but getting that extra 10% costs a lot of money, it tends to be that last 10% that sets the price of fuel. I think that one of the things the government has been criticized for is not being able to rationalize why you need a clean fuel standard as well as a price on carbon, and how those two programs work together. The real issue is that when we look, people have been studied for a long time the impact of the price on demand. So that's elasticity in terms of what the economists say. And all the studies that we've done in the past say that the long run elasticity for transportation fuels is extremely small. So we can get a short-term impact when the price goes up. And we've seen that in the past, but once people get used to that, then the demand comes back up. So, if we go back to the 70s and 80s, when we had the oil embargoes and we got these huge price increases where oil went from $3 to $30, in a few years, we see that people start to buy smaller cars. And then the price stabilizes or it comes down, and they stop buying smaller cars and they go back to buying pickup trucks. And so in the long run, we just don't see the price of the pump having a huge impact on the demand. And so if that price on carbon doesn't work, and don't forget, transportation emissions make up probably a third of our GHG emissions in Canada, then we have to find some other way to get those emissions down. And one of the ways is through standards like the CFS, or the low carbon fuel standard in British Columbia and California, when we specifically target a specific sector and give them goals and let them figure out how they're going to do it. Right? There's nothing saying they have to do biofuels. They do biofuels because those are the cheapest, lowest cost options for them.
Yeah. I was on a U.S. farm show this morning, and we were talking about next generation biofuels and what the Biden administration is going to do with the RFS and this kind of stuff. But there was some data thrown around in terms. I think it was a Harvard study talking about comparing biofuel gasoline and GHG emissions versus regular gasoline. I think the number they threw around was like 40%. So, like, can you explain that a little bit? How some of those calculations are made, and when we talk about biofuels being better for greenhouse gas emissions, can you give us give me a bit of the why?
Well, the reason is that growing the crop in the first place pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so when you do this on a life cycle basis, if you pull the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to grow the corn, and then turn the corn into ethanol and burn the ethanol, that carbon dioxide is going back. And so we're looking at this net exchange with the atmosphere. And so we don't count the carbon dioxide when we burn the biofuel, and that gives us lower emissions overall. And the reason we don't count the emissions is we didn't count the carbon dioxide coming out of the atmosphere. So it was easier to do it at the tailpipe than it was to figure out how much carbon went into growing the plant, and how much was released back when the residues, rotted on the soil and all of that kind of thing.
Mm.
So the study you're mentioning was really sort of a revisit of some of the modeling that had been done by the U.S. Government 10 years ago, where they determined that corn had a 20% reduction in GHG emissions, and that included some assumptions about how the market would respond to higher demand. And so it actually included emissions for chopping down trees in Brazil to increase crop production.
Mm.
And, we're pretty sure that actually didn't happen, that all of the demand has come about through yield increases and a little bit of shifting to more profitable crops.
So when I've talked to RI Canada, which is the biofuel lobby, when I've talked to people in government, I they're positive about the opportunity the CFS presents at a not necessarily down in the depths of the details, but there's opportunity here if done properly. From some farm groups, I have heard that all that's going to result here is Canada just importing more U.S. ethanol. Is that a reality that we should be more concerned about, or some farm groups onto something there?
Um, so the U.S. is a huge ethanol producer, the largest in the world. We do import some ethanol from them. Um, we do have some opportunity for ethanol expansion in Canada. And I think that some of the existing producers have expansion plans that they're working on that haven't announced that yet. A year ago, 2 years ago, we saw IGPC in Ontario that doubled their output, so 200 million, and we saw a drop in ethanol imports. So, that did back out ethanol imports from the States when they came up. It's always nice if the market is there first and you're filling the market rather than you build the plant and the market comes afterwards. That's a painful process to go through. So being in the position where we are importer has some positives because it's the market for the product is already established. You don't have to worry about that. However, I think that one of the things is that the U.S. market has been oversupplied. They built too much ethanol for how much gasoline they had. And so to try to build a business plan today from a grassroots situation where you're going to build an ethanol plant, it's tough to make the numbers work when you look at the margins last little while. I think where there's more opportunity is on the diesel side. And so the biodiesel market is a little screwed up in North America because the Americans have some incentives that apply to exports as well as imports. And so we see cross-border trade where Canadian biodiesel producers sell almost all their products in the United States, and we import products in the United States because both of those can generate the credit. But there's another product called renewable diesel that's a little bit different.
Yep.
That is really coming on strong with a lot of plants being announced in the US. And the nice thing about renewable diesel from the refiner's perspective is it's fungible with diesel fuel. It's easy to mix. There's no special precautions required. It can be produced with good cold weather properties, so there's no problems with all of that. And we see in California where they might have 5% biodiesel in their diesel fuel, but on top of that, they've got another 15 to 20% renewable diesel. So the renewable portion of diesel fuel in California is up to like 23%. And that's, no engine problems, no engine warranty concerns. It is a hydrocarbon, only carbon and hydrogen in the molecule, made from renewable resources. And so that's kind of the lever that refiners have. We can do 10% ethanol in all the gasoline. We can do 15%, but nobody's taken that leap yet in Canada. But going beyond that is difficult. Whereas with renewable diesel, we can go 20%, 30%, 40%.
Mm.
And if I look at what's happening with the plants in the US and everybody wanting to sell for California, I can see a situation where only renewable diesel is sold in California. No fossil diesel left. Whatever refineries there would export the fossil diesel, and that's how California refiners could meet their 20% reduction requirement by 2030. And we're
Wow.
only looking at a 12% reduction in Canada by 2030. And the CFS is actually proposing a bunch more compliance options that don't exist in California. So, I mean, we don't have to get to that, that 100% kind of level.
Well, and
And,
I and
and,
the oh, sorry, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
and that opens up a market for canola oil.
Yes.
So right now, canola oil doesn't qualify under the U.S. Renewable fuel standard for the generation of RINs, which is another credit. But we think that they've done their analysis incorrectly. And so the canola industry in the US, with support from the Canadian sector, has filed a petition with the EPA asking them to revisit their calculations because they make no sense when you compare what they did for canola and what they did for soybeans.
Yep. I've interviewed I can't remember the gentleman's name from the U.S. Canola Association, talking about the opportunity here potentially for not just canola feedstock in the U.S. but Canadian canola to be exported to the U.S. for the purposes of renewable diesel. So that could be a big win for canola growers. Um, not to get too technical, but in the U.S. we hear, you mentioned RINs. We hear a lot about RINs in the U.S. and the value of RINs, and we've had all these small refinery exemptions during the Trump administration that really took a lot of the farm news narrative.
Yep.
Does the CFS have? Are they talking about having RINs?
Not RINs per se, but they will have a system to identify the fuel, all the way through the supply chain, and it is that system that will will identify the number of credits that are initiated and sold and traded.
Okay. One of the other discussion points is obviously there is a push in Canada and the U.S. electric vehicles. We're seeing not just governments, but and state governments or provincial governments, but also car manufacturers make some pretty big pledges on what the future of EVs are. Where does biofuels fit in? Are biofuels a transition point, or are biofuels something that complement EVs? Where does all that shake out, do you think?
So the nice thing about biofuels is it can be used in existing engines, right? So we can get the GHG benefits from the existing fleet right now. Electric vehicles, we only get those benefits after those vehicles are replaced with an electric vehicle. Um, there's a I have a lot of issues with the way that the EV policy is developing because nobody's looking at it holistically. So where does the electricity come from? We'll probably need double the amount of electricity that we're using today if we want to electrify the whole fleet. So where are the plans to double the amount of electricity? We generate 20-25 billion dollars a year in fuel taxes across Canada at the federal and provincial level. How do we replace those fuel taxes, which are being used to maintain the roads and provide other services, if we're not taxing the electricity? So those are two big issues that, if we're going to have a realistic EV policy, we should be talking about those things now, and nobody wants to talk about them because they're not sexy.
Yeah.
I think there's also EV performance issues in Canada that nobody wants to talk about. So the performance of an EV is really good at 20 degrees Celsius. If you go higher, the performance drops off. If you go lower, it drops off. And so the CFS has got some numbers in it where they have the relative efficiency of a gasoline vehicle or a diesel vehicle versus an EV. They said that they took into account the cold weather, and in fact they didn't. They are mistaken about how the numbers were generated. So the EV numbers on the dash of when you go into the dealership do not have a cold weather temperature test as part of it. The gasoline vehicles do. And the little bit of real world data we see on electric vehicles, we see almost twice as much electricity being used to charge them in the wintertime as in the summertime on a per kilometer basis. So
Man,
there's lots of issues there.
how does that happen? We're Canada. It's cold in the winter. Just a heads up to everybody. Don's in Vancouver. He doesn't have to suffer through some of it, but I'll tell you, outside right now, it's very very chilly. That if we're going to get that seems like it's kind of skewing people's the realities of what people are going to deal with if they were to step out and get an EV vehicle, and if they live in Saskatoon and it's minus 30.
Yeah, and there's still as living in the world of big data. I mean, there's numbers all over the place, but they're not always the numbers that you need, and there's still a lack of good quality data that really should be part of the decision-making process for some of the stuff that just, doesn't exist or exists in little tiny bits that people haven't made public.
So when the first draft of the land use requirements came out for the CFS, there was a lot of pushback from a lot of people on what was in that document. The government made changes. Farm groups have, I think, been pretty pleased with what they see. One of the things is that this will be judged on a national aggregate basis. We won't have individual auditing of farms and things like that. How do they put those numbers together to judge that national aggregate response, what people are doing? How does that work, Don?
So exactly the same thing happened in the U.S. 10 years ago with the renewable fuel standard. They first came out with proposals to track everything back to the farm, and the industry said, look, this just isn't feasible. And they convinced the U.S. EPA that if there was no net expansion in cropland, then they didn't have to go back and trace everything back to the farm. I think that when the CFS was being developed, they looked at what was happening in Europe, where there was a lot of stuff being traced back to the farm. On paper, it looked like it was happening, and they tended to follow what was happening in Europe rather than the U.S. And that's what we saw for the initial drafts. And so the industry, both the biofuel producers and the feedstock producers, really made the case that Canada is approved under the aggregate performance in the U.S. under the RFS, and so why aren't we accepting our own data that says we're not expanding cropland? And all of these risks about land use are only an issue if we are expanding cropland. And so the industry was able to convince Environment and Climate Change Canada that looking at just a simple measure of whether or not cropland is expanding or not really resolves many of the concerns about the land use and biodiversity.
Do you think? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. So you're going to say something else?
I was going to say, I made the comment about Europe looked like they were tracing everything back, but in fact, in Europe, all the producer had to do was check a box. Are you getting support payments from the European Commission? Yes or no? And if they ticked yes, then that automatically addressed all of the sustainability issues because they were getting paid to make sure that they were complying with all the sustainability issues. So it was a bit of a no-brainer in Europe, but agriculture nowhere else in the world has a number of restrictions that the industry does in Europe.
Yes, thank goodness. So when you look at the different feedstocks to go into biofuels, should all agricultural feedstocks be excited, or should some be more excited than others? We've got corn, wheat, canola, soybeans. What are your thoughts on that? Have you looked at that?
So those are the big four, Corn is the easiest feedstock to produce ethanol from. Wheat can be done as well. It has some advantages. It has some disadvantages. Wheat works for Western Canada and corn for the Eastern Canada. Canola oil, soybean oil, as far as biodiesel and renewable diesel production go, they're pretty similar, and they're not an awful lot different than used cooking oil or animal fats, tallow and that kind of thing. So we're looking to make ethanol. We're looking for crops that have high starch, and for biodiesel, renewable diesel, we want crops with high oil content.
And how do you think farmers should like? What are you can't answer for all farmers, but from a farmer sentiment standpoint, how do you think they should be looking at this CFS? Should they be very guarded? Should they look at it as an opportunity? Like you understand some of the math of this better than anybody, Don. So I'm looking for some help and some guidance here on what we should be really thinking about when we look at this from an agricultural perspective.
Well, from a market perspective, more demand for the crop is good, right? So Canadian producers, we traditionally export more than half of what we produce in Canada, and we rely on export markets, and many of those export markets are here one year and gone the next. The nice thing about domestic markets, especially something like biofuel, they're there every year. They buy the same amount or a little bit more every year, kind of thing. And having that nice market, right in your backyard is good for anybody. I don't care if you're selling wheat and corn or if you're selling widgets. The bigger the market, the better it is. So I think that that's the good news for Canadian producers.
Yeah, and we saw this week the federal government talk about this carbon offset program. There's a lot of details yet to come out on that as well. And you mentioned earlier how all these things kind of tie together. That's the mishmash that I just get. It sort of makes my head turn.
So one of the things that CFS has said they're going to do for the crop production part of the GHG emissions is they are going to take into impact soil carbon changes due to land management practices. So producers that have adopted no-till or reduced-till, producers who have taken summer fallow out of their rotations have built and are continuing to build soil carbon. And so that soil carbon benefit is going to show up in the canola renewable diesel as a lower number than soybean renewable diesel from the United States. And so there is the potential to monetize those soil carbon benefits. To some degree, we have to share those benefits, all the way along the supply chain. But there is an opportunity for producers to maybe get some monetization of those soil carbon benefits. And we see these credits in California trading for $200 a ton US. British Columbia LCFS credits go for about $350 a ton Canadian. And so that's an awful lot more than the producer has ever gotten from a voluntary offset program for soil carbon, when they might have got $15 or $20 a ton at the max.
And on top of all this, we've got CFS, carbon offset, and then I got to mention the third, which is the carbon tax that joins this three-legged stool. It's
better three legs too.
Well, it depends. Yeah, that stool's real. I think the third leg there, the carbon tax, is one that agriculture's had a hard time getting their head wrapped around in terms of where because there's no substitute for some of these practices. Like grain drying be the classic example. Either grow corn or I don't.
I don't understand why the government, doesn't exempt natural gas from farm applications. The diesel fuel that you use on the field is exempt from the carbon tax. What's the difference between the natural gas for drying and the diesel fuel that you use in the tractor? I don't understand the rationale.
I'm going to ask you last question here. It goes to Viren. Can we mitigate our ethanol importation by expanding into more ethanol production from things like wood waste?
So people have been looking at making ethanol out of what's called lignocellulosic feedstocks for a long time, probably almost as long as I've been in the sector. It is difficult to get the technology to be cost effective. So the capital costs of the plants tend to be higher. And so, we'll have to see what happens. There's still work going on in the commercialization of cellulosic ethanol. There's a plant being built right now in Romania by a German company, a very large chemical producer. They're building plant. There's two plants that operate in Brazil using the sugarcane bagasse. One of them with technology that was developed in Canada by Iogen. But in the States, there was also three plants built with a lot of U.S. government money, and none of those plants are operating today. Two of them are being repurposed to produce other renewable fuels, and one of them is sort of dormant. So even though in the States you get a lot more money for cellulosic ethanol, they just couldn't make the economics work. So theoretically possible, still some work that has to happen to make it a reality.
Yeah. Don, this has been fantastic. I am so glad that Terry Daynard introduced us. So knowledgeable on the subject. He really shed some light and detail on some of these topics and phrases that get thrown around a lot. Where in Canada, the biofuel market feels like it's a little bit much more in its infancy compared to the U.S. And I think you really helped us and the audience out today learning a little bit about this.
Great. Thank you, Shaun.
Okay, want to mention to everybody that you need to make sure to tune into RealAg Radio today on Rural Radio 147, 4:30 Eastern, 2:30 Mountain. We got a RealAg Issues panel. We got Megan Murdoch, Lindsay Smith, and Kelvin Hepner. We're breaking down all the biggest issues of the week. Thanks a lot for tuning in today to RealAg Live, getting real and getting connected, and we'll talk to you again on Monday. Cheers, everybody.